clicking on my video. My name is Elise and today we're going to be talking about the disappearance of the Fandel children. Scott Curtis Fandel was 13 at the time of his disappearance on September 5th, 1978. His sister Amy was 8 years old at the time of the disappearance on the 5th of September 1978. The two children lived in Sterling, Alaska in a two-bedroom wooded cabin in the woods with their mother, Margaret. Margaret had been married to Roger Fandel for 10 years. Scott was actually from a previous relationship that Margaret had had, and then she had met Roger when Scott was 2, and the couple had gone on to have the daughter Amy. Roger raised Scott as his own, and the pair of them had a fantastic relationship. They were really close and spent a lot of time together. Unfortunately, the marriage started crumbling, and in January of 1978, they actually separated. Roger moved out of the home and actually moved out of the state. Margaret was left with the two children, and she began working really long hours at an Italian gardens restaurant in Sterling. Scott Fandel was described as savvy and smart. He was also described as a prankster and someone who was really protective over his sister, Amy. Amy was described as sweet and kind and the kind of little girl that everybody just adored. And the two were really close, with Scott being a really protective and caring older brother. On the night of 4th of September 1978, Margaret's sister Kathy, the children's auntie, arrived in Sterling to stay with the Fandels. She was planning on moving and gaining employment at the Italian Gardens restaurant that Margaret worked at. So the family decided to go out and celebrate at a local restaurant in town called Good Time Charlie's. Good Time Charlie's was a restaurant come arcade. At the time it was children friendly, so the four of them left and went out to dinner, and the kids played on the machine, and Kathy and Margaret shared some drinks and chatted. And around 10 p.m. Margaret and Kathy decided to take the children back to the cabin before they went out and celebrated some more on their own. So the two drove the two children back to the Fandels' cabin in the woods. Now the Fandels lived in a two-bedroom log cabin in a heavily wooded area off Scout Lake Road in Sterling. Margaret dropped the two children off and waited until the children left and went in the front door. The two then left and were reportedly going to a place called Kenai, I believe, but I may be saying that wrong, to visit a friend of theirs in a hotel. And Kenai was about 30 minutes away from Sterling, Alaska. However, apparently they couldn't find their friend, and so they came back to Sterling and spent the night at two local pubs in town. So after the children had been dropped off at the cabin, they decided to go and visit the neighbours, who were the Lupton family. The Luptons lived not very far from the Fandels, and the Fandel and Lupton children were really good friends. I believe there was 5 Lupton children, and Amy and Scott and the Lupton children would go to school together, walk to school together in the morning and play after school, and on the weekends they were really close. So they decided to head over there after they had been dropped off. So it was quite late, but they headed next door to the Luptons and played with the kids for a while. And sometime between 11 and 11:30, the Lupton mother decided that the children were getting a little bit too rowdy and a little bit too worked up, and that it was time for the Fandels to head home and the children to go to bed. So she sent Scott and Amy home, and they made their way back to their cabin. Now, a neighbour in the area reported seeing lights on in the Fandel cabin at 11:45 p.m. So I'm not sure of the exact time they arrived home, but it was somewhere between 11 and 11:45 p.m. on September the 4th. So Margaret and Kathy, meanwhile, were out partying together and having a great time celebrating, and the two of them arrived home between 2 and 3 a.m. on the morning of September 5th, 1978. When they arrived home, Margaret found the lights on in the house but didn't think this was unusual because both children were scared of the dark and slept with the lights on, so this was normal. The front door was unlocked, but the front door didn't lock. The lock was actually broken, and so it didn't lock at all anyway, so this wasn't unusual either. However, when she came into the kitchen, there was a pot of boiling water on the stove and a packet of unboiled spaghetti pasta on the bench. It's reported that Margaret didn't think much of this because Scott, being a 13-year-old boy, was a big eater and often liked to have a snack before bed, and apparently spaghetti was one of his go-to snacks. So Margaret didn't really think anything of it and headed off to bed. Now, I'm not sure whether Margaret checked on the children or not. I've read reports that she did, and I've read reports that she didn't, and there is a lot of conflicting information out there about this case. So I would encourage you to do your own research if you're interested in the case, just because there's so much conflicting stuff. So it's unknown whether Margaret checked on the children before she went to bed. In the morning, she woke up and got ready for work. She checked in on the children in the morning, however, they weren't home, and she just thought they had gone to school with the Luptons, or they had stayed the night at the Luptons and gone straight from there to school, because apparently this was quite common for the children to do. So Margaret wasn't concerned at this point. She got ready for work and left to start her shift at the Italian Garden restaurant at 8:30 the morning of September 5th. Kathy was still asleep and didn't wake until around 12 p.m. She didn't think there was anything unusual, as she knew the kids would be at school that day and that Margaret would be at work. So meanwhile, while Margaret was at work, she made a phone call to the school to speak to Amy and just to check in with the children. It was then that the school informed Margaret that neither children had turned up for school that day. So at this point, Margaret began to panic, and she told her boss that something was wrong with the children and that she needed to leave. However, her boss told her that she wasn't allowed to leave and needed to finish her shift, and so Margaret stayed. Now, around in the afternoon, approximately 3 p.m, the Lupton children actually turned up at the Fandel's house and spoke to Kathy. They asked Kathy where Scott and Amy were, and at this point Kathy was slightly concerned. She said, "I thought they were with you and that you had gone to school together," and it was then that the Luptons informed her that they hadn't seen the children since the night before, when their mum had sent the children back to their own home to sleep. So at this point Kathy started to panic. She rang Margaret at work and relayed the information to Margaret, who then phoned law enforcement and headed home. Law enforcement were immediately dispatched to the cabin and thoroughly searched everything. They questioned Margaret and Kathy both to get a rundown of the situation. However, by the time the search was carried out, it had been around 15 or so hours since the children had last been seen, and so they were dealing with a potentially heavily contaminated crime scene. There had been people in and out. Kathy had been in and out. Margaret had been in and out. The Lupton children had come. There wasn't a lot to be found. So there didn't seem to be anything out of the ordinary to Margaret or Kathy. There didn't appear to be any signs of a struggle. Nothing of the children seemed to be missing. It didn't seem like they had packed up and taken anything. It was just really unusual. The police did a thorough search, and Roger actually came back into Stirling, Alaska to help with the search for the children, but there was never any trace of them found. The only thing they found at the cabin was some bullet casings. However, they couldn't determine whether these had anything to do with the disappearance of Scott and Amy, because it was not uncommon for there to be people shooting around that sort of area, and so they couldn't determine whether the bullet casings had anything to do with the disappearance. So it was then that one of Margaret's neighbours came forward and reported seeing a black sedan in the area the night of the children's disappearance. She said that the black sedan was parked down the street and she saw it abruptly leaving quite late that evening, but couldn't give an exact time. So the police looked into this and actually found that the black sedan belonged to some carnival folks called, or otherwise known as carnies, and that had been passing through Stirling, Alaska. It had been reported before that Margaret had made friends with carny folk through her work when they would come into the restaurant, and they would often have a few drinks together, and she had on more than one occasion actually had some of these people stay at her house. When the police discovered that the car belonged to these people, they tracked them down in a nearby town. However, they found no evidence that they had the children or knew where the children had been, and so they were quickly ruled out as suspects. The police then turned their attention to the children's father, Roger Fandel. He was extensively questioned, and as far as I know, the police never found any evidence that he had the children or knew where the children could have been. There was speculation between family members that he had something to do with it, but there was never any evidence found of that, and he was ruled out as a suspect. So to this day, there has still been no trace of the Fandel children found. A few years after the disappearance, a woman came forward who was an ex-girlfriend of Roger Fandel, so I believe she was his girlfriend at the time of the disappearance. She came forward to Margaret's brother, so the Fandel children's uncle, and offered to tell him where the children were and what had happened to them in exchange for $5,000. I'm unsure whether this transaction took place or if anything ever came from it, but I'm assuming nothing did, because to this day Scott and Amy are still registered as missing persons. There is a huge amount of speculation around this case. There's a lot of finger pointing, there is a lot of he said, she said, but there is no hard evidence. There is no hard evidence to say that anybody in the family had anything to do with it. So I don't really want to get into the theories surrounding this case. I will put my sources in the description box below, and you are more than welcome to do your own research and dive right into it and read the theories for yourself. But I kind of just want to stick to the facts. Nobody has ever been charged with the disappearance. There are some people that believe Amy is still alive, and there are some people out there on Facebook and other social media sites that could potentially be Amy. However, there are a few reasons that this seems odd to me. Surely if this was in fact Amy, she would have come forward so that she was no longer a missing person and explained what had happened or made contact with her mother, and as far as I know, this hasn't been done. There is speculation that Scott was killed in the disappearance or something happened to him and Amy survived, and this is why she won't come forward, because she's afraid that she's in trouble or she's going to get somebody in trouble that may be in the family or whatever. So there's a huge amount of speculation as to what's happened to them, but no evidence. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no sign of anything missing. There was never anything found to indicate where, when, or what could have happened. So I've always found this case really intriguing. I would love to see it solved. Margaret's sober and happily married now, and still spends every day wondering what happened to her two children, and it would be so nice to give her closure. Scott Curtis Fandel was 13 at the age of his disappearance on the 5th of September 1978. He had brown hair and brown eyes. Amy Lee Fandel was 8 years old at the time of her disappearance on the 5th of September 1978. She had blonde hair and brown eyes. If you know anything about this case or you have any information at all, I will put the number down below for the Alaska State Troopers, and you can contact them with any information you may have. And all my sources will be linked below for you to dive in and do your own research and read about the case. It is a really interesting case and it is so intriguing. Thank you so much for joining me to talk about the Fandel children. I really hope that you enjoyed listening to this case. And if you are interested in more content like this, please hit the subscribe button and I will see you in my next video. Bye.